The moment my ex introduced his fiancé, his alpha brother called me mate. Hello everyone, and welcome back. Before we dive into today's story, we have one small favor to ask. If you enjoy emotional and dramatic BL stories like this one, please subscribe to our channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. It only takes a moment, it is completely free, and it is the best way to support us as we continue bringing you more unforgettable stories filled with emotion, hope, and unexpected twists. Your support truly means everything to us. Before we begin, let us know in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. We always enjoy seeing how far our stories travel and learning who is joining us from around the globe. And now, without further delay, let us begin today's story. The hardest part about seeing your past again is realizing that fate may have been waiting somewhere you never thought to look. The invitation arrived through a mutual friend with nothing more than a short handwritten note asking me to come because everyone would be there. I almost declined without reading the rest. 5 years had passed since I walked away from the life I once imagined would last forever, and I had worked too hard rebuilding myself to reopen old memories. Then I noticed the signature at the bottom of the card. Caleb Morgan. My chest tightened before I could stop it. We had loved each other through college, dreamed about traveling across the country together, and promised that no expectation from our families would ever separate us. Life had quietly proven how fragile promises could become. Caleb chose the future everyone expected him to have, while I chose the quieter road of protecting what little remained of my heart. We never argued. We never hated each other. We simply became strangers carrying the same unfinished story. I told myself attending the gathering would finally close that chapter. It was being held at an elegant waterfront hotel overlooking Boston Harbor, less than 30 miles from my apartment. By the time I arrived that Saturday evening, the ballroom was already alive with laughter, soft jazz, and the warm glow of hanging lights reflected across the harbor through floor-to-ceiling windows. Familiar faces smiled as they recognized me, asking about my work illustrating children's books and welcoming me back as though no time had passed at all. For a brief moment, I almost believed I had worried for nothing. Then I saw Caleb standing near the center of the room. He looked older, more confident, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit that matched the quiet sophistication everyone always admired about him. When our eyes met, surprise crossed his face before he smiled with genuine warmth and walked toward me. "Owen," he said, extending his hand before pulling me into a brief, respectful hug. "I am really glad you came." I smiled politely, determined not to let old emotions control the evening. "It has been a long time." "Too long," he admitted. Before either of us could say anything else, another man approached and gently rested a hand on Caleb's shoulder. He carried himself with calm confidence, offering me a friendly smile. Caleb's expression brightened in a way I had never seen before. "There is someone I want you to meet," he said. "This is Daniel, my fiancé." For one quiet second, the room seemed to lose every sound except the steady beating of my own heart. Daniel greeted me with kindness, completely unaware of the history standing between Caleb and me. I shook his hand and sincerely wished them happiness, surprised that the words felt honest instead of painful. Perhaps I really had healed more than I realized. Excusing myself, I walked toward the outdoor terrace overlooking the harbor, needing only a few minutes alone to clear my thoughts. The cool evening breeze carried the scent of the ocean while boats drifted peacefully beneath the fading sunset. I leaned against the railing and reminded myself that some endings were meant to stay in the past. I wondered if it was really you. The deep voice behind me was calm, steady, and strangely familiar despite the fact I had never heard it before. I turned slowly and found a tall alpha standing only a few feet away. His features resembled Caleb's so closely that the family connection was impossible to miss, yet everything about his presence felt different. Where Caleb carried polished confidence, this man carried quiet strength that never needed to announce itself. His eyes met mine with unmistakable recognition, and after one long breath, he spoke the single word that instantly changed everything. "Mate." The single word echoed through my mind long after the harbor breeze carried it away. I stared at the stranger, convinced I had misunderstood him. Nothing about the evening had prepared me for this moment. I knew Caleb had never mentioned an older or younger brother during the years we were together, Yet standing before me was a man who shared his features so closely that the resemblance could not be ignored. The same dark hair, the same sharp jawline, the same unmistakable alpha presence. But where Caleb had always carried himself with polished confidence, this man radiated quiet certainty that asked for nothing and demanded even less. Realizing how stunned I looked, he offered a small apologetic smile. "I should have introduced myself first," he said calmly. "My name is Grant Morgan. Caleb is my younger brother." I swallowed slowly, trying to organize the questions racing through my mind. "Did you just call me?" He nodded before I could finish. "Yes. You do not even know me." That is exactly why this makes no sense. His honesty caught me off guard. There was no arrogance in his voice, no assumption that I would immediately accept what he had said. Instead, he looked almost troubled by it himself. "I have spent my entire adult life believing stories about mate bonds were exaggerated," Grant admitted. "Until the moment I saw you walk into that ballroom." I looked away toward the dark water, searching for something familiar to steady my thoughts. Boats drifted quietly across Boston Harbor while the lights from the hotel reflected across the waves. The peaceful view stood in sharp contrast to the confusion growing inside me. "I do not believe in things happening just because someone says they are destiny," I replied. "Neither do I," Grant answered without hesitation. "That is why I am not asking you to believe me tonight." His response surprised me again. I had expected insistence. Instead, he gave me space to think. Behind us, laughter floated from the ballroom as another toast began. Through the glass doors I could see Caleb speaking with guests while Daniel stood proudly beside him. They looked comfortable together, sharing quiet smiles that did not seem forced. Whatever feelings Caleb and I had once shared belonged to another chapter of our lives. Grant followed my gaze but remained silent until I spoke again. "Does Caleb know?" I asked. Grant's expression grew thoughtful. "He knows nothing about what just happened." "Have you ever experienced this before?" "Never." He paused briefly before continuing. "And I would never disrespect my brother by creating unnecessary complications. That is why I came outside. I wanted to explain before you heard that word from anyone else." His sincerity made it difficult to dismiss him. Every instinct I had developed after years of disappointment told me to leave before emotions became complicated again. Yet something about Grant's quiet restraint made walking away unexpectedly difficult. Just then the terrace door opened behind us. Caleb stepped outside, stopping the moment he saw the two of us standing together. His eyes moved from me to Grant, then back again. The color slowly drained from his face, not because he had overheard our conversation, but because he recognized the expression on his brother's face before either of us had spoken another word. "Grant," Caleb said quietly, "please tell me I am imagining what I think just happened." Caleb remained frozen near the terrace door, his eyes fixed on Grant with a mixture of disbelief and quiet understanding that only siblings seemed capable of sharing without words. The music from the ballroom continued behind him as though the evening had not shifted in a single heartbeat, yet the silence between the three of us carried more weight than every conversation happening inside. Grant met his brother's gaze without hesitation. "You are not imagining it," he said calmly. Caleb closed his eyes for a brief moment before releasing a slow breath. There was no anger in his expression, only the unmistakable realization that something impossible had just become real. "How long?" he asked quietly. "Since the moment Owen walked through the entrance," Grant answered. Caleb lowered his head, absorbing the answer without interruption. I looked from one brother to the other, feeling like the only person who had somehow missed a conversation that had begun years before I ever arrived. "Someone needs to explain what is happening," I finally said. Caleb nodded immediately. "You deserve that." He leaned against the terrace railing beside me, watching the harbor lights shimmer across the dark water. "There is something I never told you while we were together," he admitted. "Not because I wanted to lie, but because I honestly believed it would never matter." I waited quietly. Our family has a long history of unusually strong mate bonds. My grandparents believed they could sometimes recognize early signs before anyone else noticed them. Most people dismissed those stories as old family traditions. Grant looked toward the water before speaking. I dismissed them too. Caleb gave a faint smile that quickly disappeared. "When we started dating in college, my mother met you once at a charity event. Afterward, she kept asking questions about you that seemed strangely personal. I thought she simply liked you." A cold feeling settled in my chest. What kind of questions? Whether you planned to stay in Boston, whether you had family nearby, whether you had ever experienced unusual instincts around alphas. Grant quietly finished the thought. She thought there was a possibility you might someday form a mate bond with someone in our family. I stared at him in disbelief. With you? Grant nodded once. She never told me directly. She only suggested I should accept a position overseas after graduate school, instead of returning home immediately. Caleb looked at his brother with visible regret. I never knew why she encouraged that decision. She only said distance would prevent unnecessary complications. Suddenly, dozens of forgotten memories began fitting together in ways that made no sense before. I remembered hearing Caleb mention that his brother always seemed busy whenever family gatherings came up. I remembered invitations being canceled at the last minute and holiday plans quietly changing without explanation. At the time, I had assumed our schedules simply never aligned. Now those coincidences felt painfully intentional. You were telling me your family kept us apart before we ever met? I asked softly. Grant answered with complete honesty. I think they hoped life would choose a simpler path. Before either of us could say another word, the terrace door opened once again. Daniel stepped outside carrying 2 glasses of sparkling water, smiling as though he expected to find his fiancée enjoying fresh air. The moment he noticed the expressions on our faces, his smile faded into quiet concern. Did something happen? He asked gently. None of us answered immediately, because for the first time that evening, every hidden truth had finally reached the point where silence was no longer enough. Daniel looked from Caleb to Grant, then finally toward me, quietly reading the tension that no one had managed to explain. Instead of reacting with suspicion or frustration, he simply placed both glasses of sparkling water on the terrace table and asked in the calmest voice imaginable, "Would someone please tell me the truth?" His composure caught all of us by surprise. Caleb stepped forward first. "Daniel, there is something you deserve to know." Daniel gave a small nod. "Then tell me." Caleb hesitated only briefly before continuing. "This is Owen. We were together years ago." Daniel smiled gently. "I already know that. You told me before we became engaged. You also told me that he was someone you respected very much." Caleb lowered his eyes. "There is more." Before he could continue, Grant quietly interrupted. "The rest concerns me." Daniel turned toward Grant with a puzzled expression. "What happened?" Grant never looked away. "When I met Owen tonight, I recognized him as my mate." Silence settled across the terrace once again. I expected confusion, disbelief, perhaps even anger. Instead, Daniel slowly exhaled, almost as though a question he had carried for months had finally found its answer. "So that is why," he whispered. Caleb frowned. "Why? What?" Daniel offered a faint, thoughtful smile. "Your mother visited us last month." The 3 of us stared at him. She asked whether I truly loved Caleb or whether I simply admired the life we were building together. At the time, I thought she was worried about the wedding. Grant's expression slowly changed. "She already knew." Daniel nodded. "She never mentioned Owen by name, but she kept saying that sometimes families try to protect everyone and end up hurting everyone instead." Caleb leaned against the railing, visibly overwhelmed. "She never said a word to me. Maybe she hoped the truth would never have to surface," Daniel replied softly. "Or maybe she was waiting for one of you to choose honesty before it was too late." None of us spoke for several moments. The sounds of laughter continued inside the ballroom, while the harbor breeze carried the scent of salt water through the cool evening air. Everything outside remained peaceful, even though the lives of 4 people had quietly changed forever. Finally, Daniel looked directly at Caleb. "Can I ask you one question?" Caleb nodded immediately. "Anything." Daniel's voice remained warm and respectful. "When you asked me to marry you, were you choosing me because you loved me, or because you believed that chapter of your life was already closed forever?" Caleb answered without hesitation. "I believed it was over, and I truly care about you. You have been nothing but kind to me." Daniel smiled sadly. "I know you care about me." He glanced toward me and then toward Grant before returning his attention to Caleb. But caring for someone and building a lifetime together are not always the same thing. Caleb closed his eyes briefly, unable to argue. Daniel stepped closer and rested a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "I do not want to become the person you choose simply because everyone expects you to keep moving forward." Grant watched quietly, admiration visible in his eyes. Daniel's grace made the moment even more difficult. Then Daniel looked toward me with genuine kindness and said something I never expected to hear. Owen, I think the four of us have been living inside decisions made by other people for far too long. Maybe tonight is finally the night we all start making our own. The weight of Daniel's words remained with me long after the silence returned. No one argued because no one could honestly say he was wrong. For years we had all been moving according to expectations that seemed reasonable at the time, never stopping to ask whether those expectations truly belonged to us. Caleb rested both hands on the terrace railing, staring out across the harbor with a tired expression I had never seen before. I thought doing the responsible thing would eventually become the right thing, he admitted quietly. Instead, I kept confusing peace with pretending. Daniel gave a small, understanding nod. Pretending is exhausting. Grant remained beside me, without stepping any closer, careful not to let the strange reality of the mate bond become another source of pressure. I noticed that restraint more than anything else. He could have used the moment to persuade me, to explain why fate should matter, or to convince everyone that destiny had already decided the outcome. Instead, he simply respected my space. Finally, he looked at me and spoke in the same calm voice that had never once demanded anything. Owen, I want you to hear something before this evening goes any further. I turned toward him. Go ahead. If the existence of a mate bond causes your life more pain than peace, I will walk away. The sentence caught all of us by surprise. Caleb looked directly at his brother. Daniel slowly lifted his head. Even I struggled to believe what I had just heard. Grant continued before anyone could interrupt. I will not build my happiness on guilt. I will not ask you to choose me because of instinct, family history, or destiny. If there is ever a future between us, it has to begin with your free choice. Otherwise, it is not love. It is only obligation wearing a different name. Something inside me shifted at that moment. During my relationship with Caleb, both of us had spent years trying to satisfy parents, careers, and expectations until our own voices became impossible to hear. Standing beside Grant felt completely different. He was offering me freedom instead of certainty. Daniel smiled softly, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. Now I understand why your mother was so afraid, he said. Grant frowned slightly. Afraid of what? Afraid that if the two of you ever met, Owen would see the difference immediately. None of us answered because there was nothing to argue against. Caleb let out a quiet laugh, filled with equal parts sadness and relief. He is right, he admitted. Grant has always been the stronger brother. Grant immediately shook his head. No. Caleb looked confused. Grant smiled gently. You were brave enough to admit you made mistakes. That takes strength too. For the first time that evening, the brothers looked at one another without the weight of competition or comparison. Years of unspoken expectations quietly disappeared between them. Just then Caleb reached into his jacket pocket and slowly removed a small velvet ring box. He looked at it for several long seconds before turning toward Daniel. I owe you honesty before I owe anyone a ceremony, he said. Daniel accepted the box without opening it. There was sadness in his eyes, but there was also peace. Then let us give each other the one thing every relationship deserves, he replied gently. The truth before the vows. Daniel and Caleb quietly returned to the ballroom together, asking the event coordinator for a few private minutes before any announcements were made. Grant and I remained on the terrace overlooking the harbor, surrounded only by the gentle sound of waves brushing against the docks below. Neither of us spoke immediately. The silence felt surprisingly comfortable, free from the pressure that had defined every conversation earlier that evening. After several minutes, I finally looked toward Grant. You really meant what you said, did you not? He nodded without hesitation. Every word. Even if walking away meant never seeing me again. His answer came so naturally that it almost sounded obvious. Love that depends on taking away someone else's freedom is not the kind of love I want to build. I smiled faintly, lowering my eyes toward the lights dancing across the water. You make difficult choices sound simple. Grant rested his hands on the wooden railing beside me. They are never simple. They are simply worth making. Before I could respond, the ballroom doors opened again. Caleb and Daniel stepped onto the terrace together. Neither of them looked angry or defeated. Instead, both wore the quiet expressions of two people who had finally spoken with complete honesty. Daniel walked over first. We have decided to postpone the engagement, he said gently. Not because anyone asked us to, but because promises should never continue when important questions remain unanswered. Caleb nodded in agreement. Daniel deserves a future built on certainty. Right now, I cannot honestly give him that. I felt an unexpected wave of respect for both of them. There was sadness in the moment, but there was also dignity. No one blamed anyone else. No one raised their voice. For people simply chose truth instead of convenience. Daniel turned toward me with a warm smile. I hope one day we can all remember tonight without regret. I think we will, I answered quietly. He extended his hand, and I accepted it gratefully. Take care of yourself, Owen. You too. After Daniel returned inside to speak with several close relatives, Caleb remained behind with Grant and me. He slipped both hands into his pockets and looked toward his older brother. I used to think you were always trying to protect me, he said. Grant smiled slightly. I was. Caleb laughed softly. Now I realize you were trying to protect everyone. Grant shook his head. Not everyone. I simply did not want any of us living a life chosen by fear. Caleb walked over and embraced his brother briefly before stepping back. Thank you for finally telling the truth. Grant returned the smile. Thank you for accepting it. Caleb then turned toward me. There was sadness in his eyes, but no lingering hope of changing the past. I spent years believing we lost each other because life was unfair, he admitted. Tonight, I realized we simply became different people. That does not erase what we shared. It only explains why it could not continue. I nodded slowly. Some people are meant to teach us who we are before someone else helps us become who we can be. Caleb smiled for what felt like the first completely genuine smile of the evening. I think you are finally meeting that person. He looked briefly at Grant before quietly walking back inside the hotel. As the terrace grew silent once again, Grant remained beside me without speaking. We watched the harbor together while the city lights reflected across the calm water. For the first time since arriving that evening, I was no longer thinking about the relationship that had ended years ago. Instead, I found myself wondering where the road ahead might lead if I chose to take the very first step on my own. Over the following month, life settled into a rhythm that neither of us had expected, yet both of us quietly appreciated. Grant never called unexpectedly, never appeared outside my apartment, and never used the strange reality of the mate bond as a reason to rush anything. Instead, he sent a short message every Friday asking the same simple question. Would you like to spend a few hours together this weekend? Sometimes I accepted. Sometimes I declined because deadlines for my latest children's book kept me working late into the evening. Every answer was met with the same reply. Thank you for letting me know. I hope your weekend goes well. There was something deeply comforting about someone who respected both my presence and my absence. One Saturday morning, Grant invited me to visit a place that meant more to him than any office or family estate ever could. We drove less than an hour north of Boston until the busy highways gave way to quiet neighborhoods lined with maple trees and small local businesses. Our destination was a renovated brick building overlooking a public park. A simple wooden sign above the entrance read Harbor Horizons Youth Center. Curious laughter drifted through the open windows before we even stepped inside. The building was filled with teenagers reading, painting murals, learning music, preparing college applications, and sharing lunch around long community tables. Volunteers greeted Grant by name, and every greeting felt genuine rather than formal. One teenage Omega hurried across the room, carrying a sketchbook. Mr. Grant, I finished the design you suggested. Grant accepted the notebook with complete attention, studying every page as though it belonged in an art gallery. You worked hard on this, he said warmly. I am proud of you. The young artist smiled with unmistakable confidence before hurrying back to join friends. I watched the interaction in silence. Nothing about it felt staged. Grant knew each student by name, remembered their goals, celebrated their progress, and encouraged them without ever speaking down to them. During lunch, we sat together in the courtyard while several volunteers prepared sandwiches for the afternoon program. You never mentioned this place, I said. Grant smiled. Most people only ask about my career. So what is your career? He laughed quietly. The family business pays the bills. This is the work that gives my life meaning. As the afternoon continued, I offered to help with an illustration workshop after one of the volunteers recognized my books. Within minutes, I found myself surrounded by excited teenagers eager to create their own stories. Grant remained nearby, but never interrupted, simply watching the room with quiet satisfaction as everyone encouraged one another. When the workshop ended, an elderly volunteer approached us carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You know," she said with a knowing smile, "I have not seen Grant this relaxed in years." Grant looked slightly embarrassed. "Margaret enjoys exaggerating." She laughed softly. "No, dear. I simply notice when someone finally stops carrying the whole world on his shoulders." As the sun began to set beyond the park, Grant and I walked slowly toward the parking lot. The evening air felt peaceful, filled with the sounds of children finishing a basketball game nearby. I looked at him for a long moment before speaking. I thought I was meeting the brother of someone I used to love. Grant turned toward me with quiet curiosity. I smiled, feeling lighter than I had in years. Instead, I met a man who quietly changes lives without asking anyone to notice. And I think that matters far more than destiny ever could. The seasons changed almost without my noticing. Summer quietly gave way to early autumn, and the maple trees surrounding Harbor Horizon's youth center slowly turned shades of gold and crimson. What surprised me most was not how often I saw Grant anymore, but how naturally he had become part of my everyday life without either of us forcing the relationship into something it was not ready to become. Some mornings we met for coffee before work. Other weekends we spent hours helping students prepare scholarship essays, organizing art workshops, or simply listening whenever someone needed encouragement. The more time I spent beside him, the more I realized that the mate bond was no longer the reason I looked forward to seeing him. It had become something much simpler and much stronger. I genuinely enjoyed the person he was. One Friday evening, after finishing another illustration workshop, we walked through the quiet park behind the youth center while the last rays of sunlight filtered through the trees. Grant carried 2 paper cups of hot apple cider, handing one to me with the familiar smile that always seemed to make difficult days feel lighter. "Can I ask you something?" he said after several peaceful minutes. I laughed softly. "You always ask before asking." "Old habit. Go ahead." He stopped beside a wooden bridge overlooking a small pond where ducks drifted across the calm water. For a moment, he seemed unusually thoughtful. Choosing his words with the same care he gave every important conversation. "If none of this had ever happened," he began quietly, "if there had never been stories about mate bonds, family expectations, or impossible timing, would you still want to know me?" I looked at him, surprised by the question. It would have been easy to answer quickly, but Grant deserved honesty instead of convenience. I thought about every weekend spent laughing with teenagers at the youth center, every quiet drive home after volunteering, every encouraging conversation that had slowly rebuilt parts of my confidence I believed were gone forever. I remembered how he had offered freedom instead of pressure, patience instead of certainty, and respect instead of promises he could not guarantee. Finally, I smiled. "Yes." Grant searched my face, almost as though he needed to be certain I was not simply trying to make him happy. I continued before he could doubt my answer. "The mate bond may have introduced us, but it is not the reason I am standing here today. I would choose you because of who you are when nobody is watching. I would choose the man who remembers every student's dream, who believes kindness is a form of strength, and who never asks someone else to sacrifice their freedom for his happiness." Grant lowered his eyes briefly, clearly moved by words he had never expected to hear. "You have no idea what that means to me," he admitted softly. I smiled and gently reached for his hand. This time neither of us hesitated. There was no dramatic moment, no overwhelming rush, only a quiet sense that the decision belonged completely to us. As our hands rested together, the cool breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves through the park. Grant looked at me with the same calm warmth that had been there from the very beginning. "Then let me make one promise," he said. "Not because destiny expects it, but because I do. No matter what tomorrow brings, I will always choose honesty before comfort, respect before fear, and us before appearances." Looking into his eyes, I realized that real love had never arrived with perfect timing or extraordinary certainty. It had arrived quietly, asking only one simple question that both of us were finally ready to answer with complete confidence. 2 years passed with a quiet confidence that neither of us had imagined on the evening our paths unexpectedly crossed. Harbor Horizon's Youth Center had become more than a community project. It had become a second home for hundreds of young people searching for encouragement, opportunity, and a place where they felt seen. The illustration program I helped build continued to grow, filling classrooms with creativity and reminding every student that their voice mattered. Grant remained exactly the man I had chosen. Success never changed the way he greeted every volunteer by name, remembered every birthday, or stayed late whenever someone needed advice. His strength had never been measured by authority or reputation. It had always been measured by the lives he quietly lifted every single day. One crisp October afternoon, the center celebrated its annual community festival. Families filled the courtyard, local musicians performed on a small outdoor stage, and colorful artwork created by the students decorated every walkway. Watching children proudly explain their paintings to parents and neighbors reminded me why I had fallen in love with this place long before I admitted I had fallen in love with Grant. While helping prepare the final exhibition, I noticed a familiar figure walking through the entrance. Caleb approached with an easy smile that carried none of the uncertainty I remembered from years earlier. We embraced warmly, not as former partners burdened by unfinished feelings, but as two people genuinely grateful for each other's happiness. "I have wanted to see this place for a long time," he said while looking around at the busy courtyard. "Grant always told me it was special." He was right. We spent the afternoon talking with students, visiting art displays, and sharing stories about how much our lives had changed. Caleb told me he and Daniel had remained close friends after ending their engagement, and both had eventually found the freedom to build lives that truly reflected who they were instead of who others expected them to become. "Ending something respectfully was the hardest decision I ever made," Caleb admitted, "but it also became the most honest one." I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Before leaving, Caleb found Grant arranging chairs near the stage. The two brothers stood together for a long moment before embracing with quiet affection. There were no dramatic speeches, only the simple understanding that honesty had restored something fear had nearly destroyed. As the festival drew to a close, the students gathered beneath strings of warm lights overlooking the park. One of the youngest children tugged gently on my sleeve and handed me a drawing of 4 people standing beneath a bright blue sky. Above them the child had written, "Real families help each other grow." I smiled as Grant slipped his hand into mine. Looking around at the laughter, the friendships, and the hope surrounding us, I realized that life had never rewarded me by replacing one relationship with another. Instead, it had given every one of us the courage to become better people than we had been before. Caleb found peace by choosing honesty. Daniel found freedom by refusing to settle for uncertainty. Grant proved that true strength comes from respecting another person's choices, and I finally learned that my worth had never depended on someone staying or leaving. Love reached me only after I stopped chasing the past and started believing I deserved a future built on trust, compassion, and mutual respect. As the evening sky filled with stars above the quiet park, I understood one simple truth that I hoped would stay with me forever. Fate may introduce 2 hearts, but only kindness, integrity, and the courage to choose each other every single day can transform that meeting into a lasting home.